The phone rang, and with just one short sentence from the voice on the other end, the marriage Nathan Cole believed was solid began to collapse. "Sir, I do not think the man sitting in our private banking room is you. But your wife is definitely here with a man who looks frighteningly like you." Nathan froze in his office on the 18th floor, one hand still resting on his keyboard, the financial report glowing unfinished on his screen. He almost laughed, ready to dismiss it as a ridiculous misunderstanding, until the woman's voice dropped tense and cautious, as if she herself could not believe what she was saying. She introduced herself as Elaine Brooks, head of risk management at Crescent Trust Bank's Uptown branch, and asked a question that sounded polite but terrifying, whether he was currently at the bank. Nathan answered immediately, no hesitation. No. He was at his office, and his wife Betrayal was visiting her mother in the northern suburbs. She had told him so, that morning after kissing his cheek and stepping out the door with her familiar smile. There was a pause on the line, just a few breaths, and then Elaine spoke slowly, choosing each word with care, as if saying it too quickly might shatter everything. She told him she was sorry, but he needed to come in right away. The couple had just left, and they had been requesting full access to his joint accounts. Nathan ended the call, not because he wanted to, but because his hand was shaking so badly he could no longer hold the phone. He did not shout or panic. He simply stood there, unmoving. Outside the wide glass windows, the city of Charlotte stretched under the pale winter afternoon buildings, streets and people moving as usual, unaware that inside a quiet office, one man's world had just been torn apart. Nathan was 46 years old, an internal financial manager known for caution and silence, almost invisible at company events. Colleagues underestimated him, assuming he was just a small cog in a massive logistics machine, never realizing he held the most detailed financial map of the entire system. He did not display power, he controlled it quietly. He had always believed he knew the woman who had slept beside him for 5 years, Betrayal Cole. 34, working in event management and public relations, effortlessly charming, always knowing what to say and when to stay silent, the perfect wife by every social standard. For the past 2 years, Betrayal had followed an unchanging routine, visiting her sick mother twice a week. Nathan had never gone with her. Betrayal always said her mother was too weak for visitors, and Nathan, a husband who trusted his wife, had never questioned it. Until that phone call. As he drove toward the bank, Nathan kept telling himself it had to be a mistake. Maybe Betrayal had stopped by on her way home. Maybe the man was a customer who simply resembled him. Maybe Elaine had overreacted. But the more he thought, the colder the feeling in his chest became. There were things he couldn't ignore. Betrayal had been asking about his schedule more often lately. His gym hours, his regular business trips, his late meetings always casually, too casually. Nathan pulled into the bank parking lot and noticed the security staff glance at him the moment he stepped out of his car, their expressions briefly strange, as if they were seeing a second version of someone they had already met. Inside, Elaine Brooks was waiting. When she saw Nathan, she exhaled with relief, but there was no comfort in her eyes, only the concern of someone who had just confirmed her worst suspicion. She told him they had left about 10 minutes earlier, but that this had not started today. Nathan looked at her, and for the first time in his life, he felt that he was no longer the one controlling the story. Somewhere, a man who looked exactly like him had stood at a bank counter, using that face to open the door to his life, while the woman he trusted most stood beside him. The only question left was not what was happening, but how long it had already been going on. He saw his own face on the forged identification card, and in that instant, Nathan Cole understood a chilling truth. Someone had been living his life right in front of him while he had known nothing about it. Elaine Brooks placed the thick file on the desk, her fingers trembling slightly. not from fear, but because her years of experience were screaming that this was no ordinary case. Nathan sat across from her, back straight hands, resting neatly on his knees, so calm that it almost looked like indifference. Inside, however, entire layers of memory were collapsing. Elaine spoke slowly, explaining that over the past 18 months, there had been multiple unusual inquiries on his joint accounts. Small withdrawal requests, at first, then gradually larger ones, always timed perfectly for days when Nathan was traveling for work or staying late at the office. Each time the paperwork had been flawless, the signature identical, the manner of speaking identical. Only one thing never matched: the eyes of the man lacked any trace of memory. Nathan did not interrupt. He listened as if reviewing a financial report of his own marriage, each number replaced by betrayal. When Elaine showed him the copies of the documents, he saw a familiar face, but not his own. The nose was slightly different, the jaw just a bit wider, a carefully altered version of himself. Elaine spoke quietly, saying the man had been accompanied by his wife Betrayal, and that Betrayal had failed the most basic security questions: the date the account was opened, the initial deposit amount, his mother's maiden name. Nathan felt a bitter amusement rise in his chest. Betrayal had never asked him those things. She had never needed to, because she had never truly been part of that future. When Nathan left the bank, the gray sky felt like a heavy curtain drawn across the city. Traffic moved, people hurried along, but he felt as though he was stepping out of one life and into another entirely. On the drive home, memories began to align. The casual questions about his work schedule, the seemingly harmless curiosity, the visits to her sick mother stretching over 2 years. Everything had a purpose. Every detail had been collected. The house appeared like a carefully staged set. Nathan entered, slowly observing every corner. The living room was still tidy. Their wedding photo still hung on the wall, a perfect life displayed like an elaborate lie. He opened his own closet and found them a gray sweater, a pair of jeans that had never belonged to him, but fit perfectly. Nathan sat on the edge of the bed, his breathing deep and controlled. Someone had worn his clothes, walked through his home, played his role while he was gone. Nathan was not impulsive. He did not shout. He did not break anything. He waited. When Betrayal came home that evening, the familiar smile still on her lips, Nathan looked at her as if she were a stranger. She spoke about her mother, about medication, about expenses. Nathan asked for the doctor's name. She hesitated just one breath, but for a man trained to read deviations in data, one breath was enough. When Nathan asked about health insurance, Betrayal dropped the water bottle. When he mentioned the bank, her face went pale. And when he placed the gray sweater on the table between them, everything collapsed. Betrayal sat down, her shoulders sagging, the performance over. She spoke of a twin brother, Marcus, a name that had never existed in Nathan's world. She spoke of family obligation, of fear of helping someone in trouble, but every word only revealed a harsher truth. She had chosen to betray her husband to protect a con artist. Nathan stood and looked at the woman he had once loved, and in that moment, Betrayal realized she had made one critical mistake. The man standing before her was not as weak as she believed, not as naive as she assumed. Nathan was not just a deceived husband. He controlled systems she and her brother could never fully comprehend. And when Nathan told her to leave, his voice low and steady, without a trace of hesitation, Betrayal felt for the first time in 5 years that she had truly lost control. That night Nathan did not sleep, not from fear, but from thought. What he had uncovered was only the surface. And if someone had planned to steal his life over 2 years, then Nathan would plan to take everything back in ways they would never see coming. The police called Nathan before sunrise, and the first sentence he heard told him that things were far worse than he had imagined. The woman on the line introduced herself as Detective Laura Kim, her voice calm but sharp, and said they had uncovered signs of forged property documents under his name. Nathan stood in his kitchen, one hand resting on the cold countertop, absorbing each word, like a blade cutting through his last layer of security. The house he was standing in, the place he had believed was safe, might no longer belong to him, not emotionally, but legally. He thanked the detective and ended the call without panic. In his mind, a map was already forming. Nathan was no stranger to quiet power games. At the company, he was seen as a silent mid-level employee, always seated near the back of meeting rooms, carefully taking notes, rarely speaking. No one knew he had designed the internal control system for the entire logistics chain of the corporation. No one realized that a single email from him could freeze the cash flow of dozens of projects within minutes. Nathan's real power had never been loud. It lived in precision, in knowing exactly where the system was weakest. That night, he opened his home office. He did not turn on the main lights, only a desk lamp casting a narrow beam over stacks of documents. The paperwork Betrayal had always managed, invoices, contracts, correspondence, now appeared under an entirely different lens. Nathan read slowly, line by line. He began to notice details he had once overlooked, scanned signatures instead of handwritten ones, confirmation emails sent during hours he was locked in private meetings. A chain of actions stretching nearly 2 years, careful, patient, methodical. This was not desperation. It was a plan. Elsewhere in the city, Betrayal sat in a small rented apartment, her hands trembling slightly as she held her phone. She had not anticipated Nathan's reaction. In her mind, Nathan had always been gentle, principled, easy to control. She believed that when everything came apart, he would break down, rage, lose direction. But the man who had asked her to leave the house with a calm voice that bordered on terrifying did not match the version she had imagined. Marcus, her twin brother, stood by the window, his expression cold and alert. He understood something Betrayal did not. Nathan was not ordinary prey. The next morning, Nathan walked into his office as usual. Crisp shirt, steady steps. No one suspected that the night before he had discovered his life had nearly been erased. He greeted colleagues, sat at his desk, turned on his computer. But instead of quarterly reports, he accessed the internal risk analysis system. He sent 3 emails, brief and precise, to the only people in the corporation who understood his true authority. Within 30 minutes, a chain of accounts indirectly linked to Betrayal's name was flagged for irregular activity. This was not revenge, it was confirmation. Detective Laura Kim arrived at Nathan's house that afternoon. She surveyed the home office with the sharp eyes of someone accustomed to complex cases. Nathan handed her copies of everything he had uncovered. She flipped through the pages, her expression shifting from skepticism to intense focus. This wasn't a simple case of marital fraud. It was an organized asset seizure operation with clear roles and long-term planning. Nathan did not speak of emotions. He presented data. That alone told Laura he was not a weak victim. In the silence that followed, Laura said something that made Nathan pause. She told him that if he had not received the call from the bank that day, the next phase of the plan likely involved an accident. Nothing loud, nothing overtly violent, just a plausible incident. Nathan closed his eyes for a single second, not in fear, not in panic, only with the clear understanding that he had been standing very close to the edge. As night fell, Nathan sat alone in the house that now felt unfamiliar. But he no longer felt powerless. The pieces were on the board. And for the first time since this marriage began, Nathan was no longer reacting to someone else's script. He was rewriting it, not with anger, not with tears, but with absolute control, step by step, in silence. The late-night phone call made Nathan understand that his enemies had realized he was no longer standing still, waiting to be hunted. The soft vibration of the phone on his desk shattered the silence, and a single sentence from Detective Laura Kim was enough to change the rhythm of his breathing. Brielle and Marcus had vanished. The temporary apartment was empty. Phones were off. Social media erased. Nathan set the phone down without anger or surprise. He had expected this. When people who live by planning are exposed, their first instinct is always to run. But Nathan did not chase them. He understood better than anyone that people like Marcus never truly disappear. They only change skins, and to change skins, they need money, identities, and time. All three leave traces. The next morning, Nathan arrived at company headquarters earlier than usual. While the office was still quiet, he sat before the large data screens in the control room, blue light reflecting off a face calm to the point of coldness. The systems he had once built to protect the corporation's cash flow were now being used differently. Not to destroy, but to observe. He did not look for Brielle. He looked for what Brielle needed to survive. Somewhere not far away, Brielle sat in an old rental car, her hand clenched around a phone with no signal. Marcus was in the driver's seat, his expression tight. He was used to retreating before everything collapsed, but this time was different. Nathan was not reacting like the men before him. No begging, no threats, no panic. Nathan's silence unsettled Marcus. Silence is the most dangerous thing when facing someone who knows exactly what they are doing. Nathan sent a single email to Laura Kim. Short, emotionless. Just a list of shell companies, intermediary accounts, and a brief note. Small, repeated, scattered transactions were how people like Marcus survived, and they were also how they were exposed when someone patient enough began to connect the pieces. Laura read the email twice. She understood then that Nathan was not just a victim. He was actively leading the way. That evening, Nathan returned to the house, now stripped of familiar perfume, of soft footsteps passing behind him. The house was empty, but not cold. He stood before the bedroom mirror, looking at his own face, the face that had been copied, altered, and used as a weapon. In that moment, Nathan felt no rage. He felt release. The person who tried to become him would never understand this. Real power was not in appearance. It was in knowing who you were when every mask had been torn away. 2 days later, Laura Kim called again. An account in another state had been frozen. A new name, sophisticated forged documents. But the habits had not changed. Nathan smiled faintly. Marcus could change names, faces, cities. He could not change his nature, and nature always leaves patterns. Meanwhile, Brielle began to feel something she had never felt in all the years she lived inside a script of her own making. Fear. Not of the police, not of the law, but of the fact that Nathan was not looking for her. He did not call. He did not text. He did not ask for explanations. That silence followed her like a shadow, reminding her that a man was watching from a distance, unhurried, precise. That night, Nathan sat in his office reopening old emails and messages that once seemed meaningless. He was not searching for more evidence to accuse. He was searching for truth to bring closure. With every detail he connected, he became more certain of one thing. This marriage had never been his mistake. It had been a test he survived in the only way possible, without losing himself. Outside the window, the city glowed under the night lights. Nathan stood shut down the computer, and for the first time in a long while, exhaled deeply. The hunt was not over, but he was no longer prey. And somewhere out there, Brielle and Marcus were beginning to understand the one thing they had underestimated the most. The man they believed they could manipulate was the same man who was quietly sealing every exit, step by step, in silence. The break-in happened while Nathan was not home, and that single fact forced him to revise every assumption he had made so far. The security alert triggered in the middle of the afternoon, a brief notification appearing on Nathan's phone while he was seated in a closed-door meeting at work. There was no sound of shattering glass, no forced entry, just a clean, authorized movement, as if the person entering knew exactly how to neutralize the system within a few seconds. Nathan did not stand up. He did not leave the meeting. He simply dismissed the alert, memorized the time, and continued listening to the discussion in front of him, as if nothing had happened. Inside, however, the pieces were locking into place. Marcus was no longer running. He was coming back, not out of recklessness, but desperation. When Nathan returned home that evening, everything looked almost untouched. No furniture disturbed, no obvious signs of searching. Only one detail was wrong. A folder in the home office had been shifted just slightly out of alignment. To anyone else, it meant nothing. To Nathan, it was a message. Someone had been there, not to steal, but to remind him. Nathan stood in that room for a long time without turning on the lights. In the darkness and silence, he understood a crucial truth. Marcus had not come for documents. He had come to measure distance, the distance between Nathan and fear. At a roadside motel several hours outside the city, Betrayal sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clenched tight. She was no longer playing the role of the perfect wife. That mask had fallen away. But what replaced it was not remorse. It was panic. Marcus had just returned from a short trip, his expression more tense than ever. He told her that Nathan was not reacting as expected. No pleas, no retreat, no instinctive self-defense. That unsettled Marcus more than any police presence ever could. Nathan knew they would come back, and he knew something else. Marcus did not understand that he was not dealing with a betrayed husband, but with a man who had spent his entire career predicting risk and controlling damage. That night, Nathan called Laura Kim. He did not report the break-in. He asked only one question: how long before official surveillance authorization would be approved. Laura was silent for a few seconds before answering. Very soon, because what they were doing now was no longer fraud. It had crossed into threat territory. The next day, Nathan continued his routine exactly as before. Work, gym, coffee at the usual place. He changed nothing, did not alter his routes, did not increase personal security. That calm was what kept Betrayal awake at night. She watched the news, checked accounts, waited for a reaction that never came. In her mind, Nathan should have collapsed. He should have come looking for her. But he did nothing, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. 3 days later, Marcus made his first mistake. A small transaction, insignificant on its own, was processed through an old intermediary account. He believed no one was watching anymore. But Nathan had been watching for a long time, not by chasing, but by waiting. When Laura Kim called back, her voice carried more than seriousness. It carried certainty. They had narrowed the location, not enough for an arrest yet, but enough to tighten the net. That evening, Nathan returned home earlier than usual. He sat alone at the dining table, warm light casting shadows on empty walls. In that quiet moment, Nathan thought about his marriage, not with pain, but with clarity. He realized Betrayal had never loved him the way he understood love, but she had misjudged one thing. She thought kindness was weakness. She thought silence was surrender. And that mistake had brought her here. Outside, the city continued to move. Betrayal and Marcus were still free, but Nathan knew they were entering the most dangerous phase. When predators realize their prey is not running, they either retreat or attack. And Nathan was prepared for both. He stood, turned off the lights, locked the door, and in the darkness, one thought rang with absolute clarity. This game was no longer about money or identity. It was about who would control the ending. And this time, Nathan was not reacting. He was leading step by step, forcing them to reveal themselves in the rhythm of their own breath. Nathan realized the trap had been triggered, when an old name appeared on the system screen, a name that should have been dead long ago. It was not Betrayal, not Marcus. It was a legal entity used in the earliest transactions, the primitive shell of the entire operation. Its return was not accidental. It was a distress signal. And for people like Marcus, a distress signal was also a confession. Nathan sat motionless in the data room, blue light reflecting off eyes focused to the point of coldness. He did not call Laura Kim right away. He waited, letting the next sequence of actions reveal itself. Small transactions began to cluster. Not large sums, not noisy. But the rhythm was familiar, like the heartbeat of someone panicking while trying to appear calm. Marcus needed money urgently. And when someone needs money urgently, they trade precision for speed. Across the city, Betrayal sat in a temporary room, neon light flickering outside the window like a warning. She had not slept properly in days. Every passing car made her flinch. Marcus said they needed to move again. But Betrayal understood they had nowhere left to go. The network that once protected them was tightening. What frightened her most was not the police, but the fact that Nathan had never confronted her directly. That absence felt like a suspended sentence hanging over her head. Nathan left the data room and walked calmly through the familiar corridors of the company. No one noticed him. That was his advantage. He sent a single message to Laura Kim, one line only. The target was moving exactly as predicted. Laura did not reply immediately, but Nathan knew she understood. People like Laura never needed many words. That evening, Nathan drove out of the city, not following his usual route. He did not carry his personal phone, only an encrypted device Laura had provided. He was not fleeing. He was completing the perimeter. In the rearview mirror, streetlights slipped away like closing chapters. Marcus made his second mistake just before dawn. A phone call unencrypted, careless. A rare moment of weakness when he believed Betrayal was the only one still on his side. That call was logged. The location was identified. Not perfectly precise, but enough to narrow the radius. Laura Kim called Nathan while the sky was still dark. Her voice was low and firm. "We have them within control." Nathan pulled over to the side of the road and turned off the engine. In that moment, he felt no triumph. Only a deep, quiet relief. Everything was unfolding exactly as mapped in his mind. Not fast, not slow. Precise. At the final hiding place, Betrayal realized Marcus was no longer leading. He was restless, irritable. Poor decisions were starting to surface. She looked at her twin brother and for the first time saw the person beneath the confident mask. Someone who lived by borrowing other people's identities, yet had never known who he was without a role to play. When Laura Kim's team closed in, Nathan was not there. He did not need to witness it. He had seen this ending long ago. For him, justice was not about direct confrontation, but about every piece returning to its rightful place. The next morning, Nathan returned to work, drank coffee, answered emails, finished an unfinished report. Life on the surface continued as if nothing had been disrupted. But inside, he had crossed an important boundary. He was no longer someone dragged into another person's story. Laura Kim sent a short message. Arrest made. No further explanation needed. Nathan read it, shut off the screen, and leaned back in his chair. He thought of Betrayal not with hatred, but with late understanding. She had chosen a path with only one possible ending, and she had pulled him into it, believing he would collapse. But Nathan had never collapsed. He had only observed in silence, learned, and waited for the exact moment to act. As the morning sunlight streamed through the window, Nathan straightened his collar, and walked out of the room. One chapter had closed, and this time he was the one who decided when it ended. The interrogation room door closed, and in that instant, Betrayal understood that her life had turned onto a path with no return. The room was cold white light pouring down onto her face, exposing every crack in the last fragments of her composure. She had rehearsed this moment hundreds of times in her mind, but when it truly arrived, every script collapsed. Marcus was no longer beside her. There was no backup plan, only the raw truth and a single name that refused to leave her thoughts: Nathan. In the room next door, Marcus sat with his head lowered, his hands clenched tight. For the first time in his life, there was no role left to wear, no borrowed identity, no admiring gaze from a victim. Only a man stripped bare, forced to face himself. In his mind, everything was Nathan's fault. If that man had panicked, run, or begged, everything would have been different. But Nathan had done nothing at all, and that silence had destroyed everything. Nathan wasn't at the police station. He was standing in a glass meeting room on a high floor of an unmarked building. Outside, the city stretched beneath the afternoon light. Laura Kim stood across from him, a thick file resting on the table. She did not ask how he had known every move in advance. She asked only one thing: how long he had been preparing. Nathan looked out the window, his voice low and even. Since the day he noticed gaps he could not explain in his life, since the numbers did not add up, since the stories repeated with unnatural perfection. He had not suspected immediately. He observed, and when he was certain, he did not react. He built a plan. Nathan's true power had never been money or titles. It lay in a level of patience so deep that others consistently underestimated it. Laura nodded. She had seen many victims, but rarely someone who could remain so clear-headed after such a profound betrayal. Nathan did not seek revenge. He sought an ending. In the interrogation room, Betrayal finally began to speak. At first came the evasions, the stories that had once worked so well. But as the evidence was laid out one piece after another, her voice broke. She did not cry for Marcus. She cried because she realized she had never truly understood the man she believed was easy to control. Nathan had never been weak. He had simply chosen not to display his strength. Marcus remained silent, the heavy silence of someone who had lost. He replayed every moment, every small step that had seemed harmless. He had thought himself the hunter. Instead, he had been prey, guided slowly into a trap. That evening, Nathan returned to the old house. There was no sense of danger anymore, no lurking shadows. He walked through each room not to search for memories, but to close them. Each object was now only an object. The greatest power he had reclaimed was not money or reputation, but peace of mind. Laura called after night had fallen. She told him everything was moving as expected. The trial would be long. The truth would come out. Nathan listened, then thanked her. When the call ended, he stood alone in the living room, soft light washing over the walls. He thought of Betrayal, not with anger, but with a distant sadness. She had chosen her path, and he had chosen not to let it define him. Outside, the city lights came alive. People continued to live, to love, to trust. Nathan knew he would never be the same again. But he also knew he was far stronger than the man who had once been underestimated. When he turned off the lights and walked out of the house without looking back, it was not escape. It was departure under his own control, carrying a lesson that was costly but necessary. And somewhere in those cold rooms, Betrayal and Marcus finally understood one thing. The man they believed was prey had never been hunted. He had only waited for the exact moment to let the game end by his rules. The verdict was delivered on a morning that seemed ordinary, and within a few short sentences, years of deception officially collapsed. Nathan was not inside the courtroom. He stood outside the building, his back against the cold stone wall, listening to the steady rhythm of glass doors opening and closing behind him. Inside, Betrayal sat before the judge, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the emptiness in her eyes. Marcus was escorted in through a side entrance, head lowered, refusing to look at anyone. That moment marked the legal end. But for Nathan, it was only the final layer being peeled away, not an emotional climax. He left the courthouse before the hearing concluded, not out of fear of the truth, but because he no longer needed to witness it. Everything that mattered had already been revealed. Everything that needed proof had been recorded. His true power was not in watching them fall, but in moving forward without allowing the past to pull him back. In a temporary holding cell, Betrayal sat alone, her hands resting lightly on her knees, trembling almost imperceptibly. In that rare moment, without observers, without a role to play, she finally allowed herself to admit a bitter truth. She had never truly understood Nathan. Throughout their life together, she had studied his habits, his schedule, his visible weaknesses. But there was one thing: she had never reached the inner strength of a man who never needed to prove he was strong. Marcus was different. For him, the failure carried no philosophical weight. It was compressed rage. He thought of the years spent running the faces that had once trusted him completely. He had never imagined being defeated by someone who did not fight back. But now, with every escape closed, he understood too late. The most dangerous person is not the one who shouts, but the one who watches in silence. Nathan returned to his office that afternoon. No one asked about the trial. No one mentioned Betrayal or Marcus. They only saw a man completing his work with familiar focus. Inside, however, a deep shift was taking place. For the first time in a long while, he no longer needed to be alert, no longer needed to calculate, no longer needed to leave space for a sudden blow. That evening, Nathan met Laura Kim at a small, quiet cafe, not to discuss the case, but to close the final connection between him and the nightmare. Laura told him the case would be added to training files, a textbook example of organized crime and the exploitation of trust. Nathan smiled faintly. He had no desire to be an example of anything. He only wanted to return to himself. When he left the cafe, Nathan walked for a long time. The city at night breathed differently, slower, more honest. He looked at lit windows, at strangers living lives of their own. He knew he would never see the world the same way again. Yet instead of bitterness, he felt a strange gratitude. He had lost much, but he had kept what mattered most. Elsewhere, Betrayal lay on a narrow metal bed, staring at the gray ceiling. She thought of all the ways things could have been different if she had not misjudged that man. Not because he was stronger, but because he knew exactly who he was. Regret arrived too late, useless now, left only to gnaw at each waking moment. Nathan reached his new apartment late at night. No excess furniture, no old memories, just a clean space built for beginning again. He set his keys on the table, sat down, and took a deep breath. No unfamiliar sounds, no threatening shadows, only the quiet of someone who had walked through the storm and remained standing. And in that quiet, Nathan understood something important. True revenge is not watching others collapse. It is continuing to live well, and never allowing the past to control the future again. The envelope appeared on Nathan's desk early one morning. No stamp, no return address. And inside was only a thin sheet of paper with a single sentence that made his heart pause. Not everything was over as he thought. Nathan did not check the security cameras right away. He held the paper, felt the texture of the ink, noticed the scent of new paper. The sender wanted him to know they were very close enough to place it on his desk without leaving a trace. Once again, the silent game had been activated. But this time, Nathan was no longer being pulled in. He was the one reading the pattern. Elsewhere, Laura Kim received a call with no caller ID. The voice on the other end did not give a name, only shared a detail known only to those who had once been part of the old network. Laura understood immediately. There was a deeper layer. Brielle and Marcus were not the top of the iceberg. They were only the first exposed links. Nathan listened as Laura explained everything in a sealed room with no windows. She spoke of dormant accounts waking up, of legal entities long vanished suddenly moving again. Someone was testing Nathan's reaction, testing what the man once seen as only a victim would do next. Laura watched him expecting concern. What she saw instead was a calm so unsettling it felt dangerous. Nathan was not angry. He was not afraid. He recognized this as the plot twist his opponents had failed to anticipate. They believed he would retreat to preserve the peace he had just reclaimed. They believed he would choose silence and move on. But they had misjudged the nature of his true power. Power did not come from weapons or money. It came from understanding the system and knowing how to force it to expose itself. Nathan proposed a plan no one expected. No pursuit. No attack. He wanted to become bait. But not weak bait. Controlled bait. He agreed to let carefully selected information leak a signal, suggesting he was preparing to withdraw funds, transfer assets, and start a new life elsewhere. A signal tempting enough to pull whoever was hiding into the open. Laura hesitated. She understood the danger, but she also knew those behind it would not stop. They were only waiting for a better moment. And Nathan was the only key capable of forcing them to surface. In the end, she nodded. In the days that followed, Nathan lived as if he truly were leaving. Selling shares, meeting lawyers, packing documents. Everything was done openly, but without spectacle. Rumors spread. Watching eyes returned. Nathan felt it in every step, every pause between calls. Inside the detention center, Brielle heard the news. She did not know the source, but instinct told her Nathan was pulling one final thread. She began to fear the people she once believed untouchable. For the first time, she understood the feeling of a piece that had finished its role. Marcus laughed when he heard, a warped smile. He believed Nathan had finally chosen to run, but that belief was his final mistake. When a predator believes its prey has fled, it steps out of the shadows to finish the kill. The decisive night came sooner than expected. A meeting was arranged. No weapons, no threats. Only a proposal of cooperation from a name that had never appeared in any official file. Nathan agreed to meet. The location was his choice. The time was his decision. In that room, as the man across from him began to speak, Nathan understood the final truth. He was not merely a surviving victim. He was the only one who had seen the entire structure from the inside and remained clear-minded. The other man realized too late that he was not facing someone underestimated. He was facing someone who had moved beyond fear and now stood in a position to decide the fate of an entire network. When the door closed, Nathan knew the most dangerous part was not yet over. But he also knew that from this moment on, he was no longer reacting to the darkness. He was guiding it. And that was the moment the game truly turned. The meeting took place in a room without windows, and the moment the door closed behind Nathan, the man across from him realized he had stepped into a space where every familiar advantage was meaningless. There was no handshake, no polite greeting, only a dense silence, heavy like the pressure before a storm. Nathan sat down first, his movements slow and completely controlled. His gaze did not probe or challenge. It was calm to a degree that unsettled the other man and threw him off balance. That was his first mistake. He believed he was speaking to a victim pushed to the edge, but Nathan had never been there. The man began with a familiar narrative, promises of cooperation, safe options, escape routes drawn in the confident tone of someone used to controlling the game. He spoke of power behind the scenes, of names that never appeared in official records. He assumed Nathan needed to hear this. But Nathan listened differently. He did not listen to words. He listened to breathing, to irregular pauses, to the anxiety carefully buried beneath manufactured confidence. When the man stopped and waited for a response, Nathan finally spoke. His voice was low and even stripped of emotion. He mentioned accounts that seemed anonymous, transactions dismissed as too subtle to matter. He called out the exact names of legal entities known only to those at the deepest level. Each name spoken tore away another layer of disguise. The man shifted in his chair. His hands tightened. His eyes wavered. The plot twist landed in that moment. Nathan was not the one lured into this room. He was the one who had dragged this meeting into the light. The man tried to reclaim control. He laughed, said Nathan was only guessing that there was no direct evidence. Nathan nodded. He agreed. Then he placed a small device on the table. Not a recorder, not a weapon. Just a screen showing connections being locked down in real time. Financial routes shutting off, accounts freezing, no alarms, no announcements. Only the lethal silence of a system having its oxygen cut off. The man understood too late. This was not a negotiation. It was a notification. Nathan had never needed to prove strength. He only needed to wait for the exact moment when the other side would realize they had already lost everything. Elsewhere, Laura Kim followed the developments through cold metrics on her screen. She knew Nathan was doing something dangerous, but she also knew this was the only way to end it completely. Not by arresting individual links, but by severing the lifeline of the entire network. She watched alerts appear, saw delayed reactions, and then the collapse began to spread. In the room, the man across from Nathan stopped talking about cooperation and turned to threats. He spoke of consequences of what would happen if Nathan did not stop. Nathan stood up. That single motion ended the meeting. He looked directly into the other man's eyes, and for the first time revealed one thing, only certainty. He said everything had already happened, that from the moment the envelope appeared on his desk, the game no longer belonged to those who pulled strings in the dark. When Nathan stepped outside, the afternoon light hit his face. There were no gunshots, no immediate arrests, only a chain reaction already in motion, irreversible, and spreading everywhere. Those who once believed themselves invisible began to panic. Silent allies turned away. A network that had survived on fear was now being suffocated by that same fear. That night, Nathan returned to his apartment. He did not turn on the lights immediately. He stood in the darkness and felt his own breathing. No longer watched, no longer performing, but he also understood this was not the end. This was a transition from defense to control, from survival to shaping the future by his own rules. Somewhere those who had underestimated him were beginning to understand. True power is not about who gives orders. It belongs to the one who knows when to remain silent, when to step forward, and when to simply stand still and let the entire system collapse around him. And Nathan, once seen as prey, had become a boundary no one would dare cross again. The news exploded while Nathan was sleeping, and within just a few short hours, names that had once been invisible began appearing across every financial broadcast. It was not news of arrests or verdicts, but a chain collapse. Investment funds froze. Shell companies declared bankruptcy. Offshore accounts were locked simultaneously. A network that had operated in the shadows for years was dissolving like sand in water, and what unsettled observers most was not the speed, but the silence. No one stepped forward to take responsibility. No one tried to deny it. It was as if the entire system had unplugged itself and accepted erasure. Nathan woke up, made coffee, turned on his computer. He read the news like a bystander. No smile, no satisfaction, only acknowledgement. This wasn't a personal victory. It was the inevitable consequence of a structure struck at its core. The true twist was that no one except Nathan understood why everything collapsed at the same moment. Those who once dismissed him as a minor variable never realized that his patience was the most dangerous leverage of all. Elsewhere, Laura Kim walked into an emergency meeting. Cybersecurity experts, financial analysts, legal teams sat around the table, all visibly tense. Data poured in non-stop. Cross-links between organizations surfaced. Laura studied the schematic on the screen and grasped the real scale of what had been triggered. Nathan hadn't cut off a branch. He had exposed the entire root system. Inside the detention facility, Brielle heard the news through fragmented conversations among staff. She sat motionless. No fear, no hope, only complete emptiness. Only now did she understand why Nathan had never tried to destroy her directly. He did not need to. What he did was far larger. He allowed the system she trusted to betray her, instead a punishment without rage. Marcus reacted differently. He slammed his fist into the wall when he heard. In that instant, he understood when he had truly lost. Not when he was arrested, not when he was sentenced, but when Nathan refused to play by his rules. Marcus had believed power came from making others afraid. Nathan proved that real power came from making an entire system afraid to exist. Nathan received a call from Laura that afternoon. She said everything was under control, but the aftershocks would continue. New names would surface, new cases would open. Nathan listened, then said something that made Laura pause. He told her he did not want to be involved any further. His role was finished. The rest belonged to the law. That evening, Nathan walked through the park near his home. Leaves whispered underfoot. No watchful eyes, no sense of being hunted, but no complete relief either. He knew his life had shifted onto a different trajectory. He would never be the man he once was, but he was no longer a victim. He thought of those crushed by that system, the names never printed, the lives erased, because they trusted too easily. Nathan knew he was lucky, not because he was smarter, but because he chose to stop and observe, while others rushed to react. Across the city, Laura stood by her office window. She thought of Nathan not as a victim or a hero, but as a marker. A man who proved that sometimes the greatest power does not need spectacle. It only needs timing. Night fell. Nathan returned to his apartment. He opened the window, letting cool air spill inside. The city glittered with lights. Life went on. But somewhere in dark offices and frozen accounts, a lesson was spreading quietly. Never underestimate the silent ones. Never assume the unresisting are weak. Nathan stood there for a long time, not planning the next move, not fearing consequences, simply feeling his own presence. The hardest part was over. What remained was no longer a battle. It was the slow rebirth of a man who had passed through darkness without letting it define him, and stepped out with the power to choose his life in an entirely different way. The doorbell rang before dawn, cutting through the fragile quiet Nathan had only just begun to grow used to. On the other side of that door was not danger, but the true full stop to everything that had once threatened him. The messenger was a middle-aged legal official, his face serious, but his eyes carrying a sense of relief. He handed Nathan a thin folder, only a few pages, yet heavier than anything Nathan had ever held. The case was officially closed. No open investigations remained. No hidden branches were left untouched. The network had been completely exposed. Those who once believed themselves untouchable were now nothing more than archived files in the justice system. Nathan closed the door. The apartment returned to silence. Early morning light spilled through the window, falling across his face, no longer tense, no longer guarded. There was no victorious smile either. He stood there for a long time, as if listening to the final echo of a storm that had just passed. In another city, Laura Kim attended the final review meeting. Senior officials sat in silence as the report concluded. No one spoke much, because everyone understood this was a rare victory, not born of force, but of patience and precision. Laura closed her eyes for a brief moment. In her mind, Nathan's image was clearer than any chart. A man who never asked for power, yet forced an entire system to adjust simply by existing. In the days that followed, Nathan packed up his apartment. Not to run, but to close a chapter. Each item put away felt like a memory placed where it belonged. He did not take much with him, only what truly mattered. The rest he left behind with the past. People tried to reach out. Journalists, consultants, even figures who once hovered at the edges of the shadows, now eager to ensure they had never misjudged him. Nathan refused them all. Not out of fear, but because he understood that attention itself was the last remaining danger. The final plot twist was not that Nathan became rich famous or publicly powerful. It was that he chose to disappear from every map of influence while retaining absolute control over his own life. Those who once thought him weak because of his silence would never get the chance to correct their mistake. One afternoon, Nathan stood by the sea. The wind was strong, carrying salt and distant memories. He thought of the person he once was, someone who tried to please the world, who believed that kindness alone would make everything right. He did not regret it, but he had learned something essential. Kindness does not need to be loud, and true strength does not need to prove itself. Somewhere else, Betrayal and Marcus began their long days behind bars, each locked inside their own silence. No stage remained. No audience existed. Only time slow and unforgiving. That was the ending they had never planned for. Nathan turned away from the sea and walked on. His steps were calm, unhurried. No one recognized him in the crowd, and that was freedom. If you have followed this story to this point, take a moment to reflect. Where are you watching from? Which city? Which corner of life? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. If this story resonated with you, tap like and subscribe so you do not miss the journeys ahead. Because sometimes the greatest strength begins with daring to listen to a story and recognizing yourself within it.